Good day. Nice to see you all here. Thanks for turning up in this beautiful, beautiful weather. Well, I think Ben's introduced what I'm going to do, and we're going to do some any questions. I'm happy to answer them on any aspect of comics or animals or whatever later. But we're going to be talking about anthropomorphism today. And anybody read Grandville? Anybody, you've read Grandville? All right, okay. Well, I was going to say, if you have, you won't have seen this picture because this didn't appear in any of the books. This was the when you send proposals to publishers, for graphic novels, you also have to submit a sample of the art style you're going to do the story in, and this is what I chose for Grandville. And this is my protagonist of the story, Detective Inspector LeBrock of Scotland Yard. And there's several reasons he's a badger. And one of the reasons is badgers are very tenacious and can be very ferocious, but once they start after something, they won't stop, and that's the sort of quality that I wanted. So he sort of has the deductive abilities of Sherlock Holmes, but being a badger, he's a bit of a bruiser, so he's quite happy to beat the living spit out of somebody to get, a baddie to get information, whatever. But usually when I do a graphic novel, I'm thinking about it sometimes for years in advance and making lots of notes, and literally. I mean, there's one book I've been thinking about 15 years now, and it's still not reached critical mass, but I've got lots of others in the background. But the difference, this first Grandville just came to me in just a flash of inspiration. And the inspiration was the work of this man, Jean-Ignace Isidore Jarrat, who was a French illustrator in the first half of the 19th century, who did hundreds of these fantastic anthropomorphic pictures of animals. And there was a Tyrrell who was taking the make out of fashions and, the mode at the time, different the character types of the period. And I'd had this book for some while, but I was just happened to be looking at it, and I thought, Grandville, that could be the nickname for Paris in an alternative world populated by anthropomorphic animals, where it's the biggest city in the world. And that whole idea came from that. I thought, well, how come it's the biggest city in the world? Or Napoleon won the Napoleonic Wars, yeah. And you can build up the history from there. LeBrock's an English working class badger who ends up going to France. But, his name was Jean-Ignace Isidore Jarrat, but his pen name was J.J. Grandville. And it was that inspired the thing. But he was a big influence on John Tenniel, who did the later Alice illustrations. And I think if you look at this veal on here, you can see the influence of that on this famous picture from Alice. There's a mock turtle there. Oh, that griffin. There's a character in the fourth Grandville, Grandville Noël, in which there's a fascist party. It's led by this griffin, who's called Nicholas Griffin. I don't know if you recognise Nick Griffin from the BMP at the time. That he's a parody of him. Get my thing right. But they're not new. Nothing new about anthropomorphic animals. I mean, anthropomorphic characters have been around as long as people have told stories. These are some cave paintings, of course. That's from Toifre cave in France. This is the Lohnmensch, the so-called lion man of Hadstatten. It's a German name, German place. But it's over 40,000 years old, and it's the oldest example of figurative art in the world. And look, it's got a lion's head. There's actually debate about whether it's a man or a woman now. It's been called for decades the Lion Man. That it's called, it's called either Lion Man or Lion Woman, depending on your preference these days. So they've been around since the dawn of time. They're in all the myths and legends throughout the world. Some ancient Greek ones. These anthropomorphic animals. Well, these two are Zeus in disguise, but they're in all the major religions. This is Hanuman from the Rayama. But this is probably more famous. This Japanese version of the character, Sun Woo King. There was a TV series quite a while ago, a few decades ago, called Monkey, based on him. Of course, the religion of ancient Egypt, all the gods are animal-headed. And there's even, in the Bible, the first chapter, we have an anthropomorphic serpent in the Garden of Eden. But I think modern anthropomorphic stories can be traced down to one guy, basically, Aesop, who was writing fables in, I think, the 4th century BC. He was a freed slave, and he made up all these fantastic fables, such as the tortoise and the hare, and the town mouse and the country mouse, the ant and the grasshopper, things like this. This is a series of Victorian trading cards by a cartoonist called Charles H. Bennett, who did cartoons for Trump, Punch, and other things. A trading card set, but these are based on Aesop's fables. So the tortoise and the hare. It's by Arthur Rackham, famous illustrator. And they continued these stories from all the way through history. This is from the 13th century. There was a cycle of these stories featuring Reynard the Fox that were told. Well, I think they were written down. So people did write them down, but they were sort of told orally in England and France and Germany and lots of other places. This is the 13th century from Book of Hours, which is in Utrecht in Germany. You can see this fox with a monk's cowl over it. He's a sort of trickster figure, Renard. As a lot of them are. Now, I don't know if there's any Jewish people in the audience, but you probably know what a Haggadah is. Yeah, it's like a learning tool to teach kids about the flight from Egypt, about the slaves, and it happens every Passover. This is a Passover Seder, and this was only the 13th century, and sort of Orthodox Judaism. It's a bit like sort of a lot of the Muslim Orthodoxies today. Figurative art is actually banned. I mean, you know what the second commandment is? Thou shalt not take unto thee any graven image, which is taken to mean that shouldn't portray somebody in the image of God, i.e. man, because humans are supposed to be in his image. So this artist has very cleverly got round this by putting birds' heads on the in this illustration. It's from 13th century. And of course they continued in fairy stories and folklore. Little Red Riding Hood here. And not just in Europe, but all over the world. I mean, there's a strong series of African folklore. In West Africa, you have the Anansi, the trickster spider, and the Kalahari Bushmen have blue mantis and lots of other things. I mean, there's lots of these anthropomorphic characters in stories, but a lot of these stories which were told orally, they emigrated to America during the slave trade from the 15th century onwards. And there they some of them intermingled with Native American stories. And there's a whole set of stories about Brer Rabbit, which have come directly from Africa. Who's a trickster rabbit, again. And this is from the Tar Baby story. And here you can see they were actually, I mean, a lot of people documented these stories. They went round, folklorists documented these stories. But there's one set of stories about Brer Rabbit that are remembered, and they're the ones by this Noel Chandler Harris up here. And they're remembered because he invented this character called Uncle Remus, who tells the stories as a storyteller, and it sort of binds them all together. And this is actually from, this is a newspaper strip, but they were all published in books. They were very popular in the 19th century. And quite a few people wrote these, including Theodore Roosevelt's uncle, I believe. That's quite nice. The Hopi Indians have these called kolchakas, which aren't, they're not gods, deities, but they're sort of anthropomorphic representations of anything, famine, a mountain, the wind. And they're actually used to teach children about life. Each one represents a different, anything it can be. This is quite interesting, very early English comic strip, which was a political broadsheet that was handed out on the street. This is 1782. And it's by Rowlandson, who's a very famous English illustrator. But you can see it's a comic strip. Every aspect of a modern comic strip is in there. It's got panels laid out sequentially. It has speech balloons. It has text boxes. It even has thinks balloons, look. Here's what these animals are thinking. Got the loves of the fox and the badger. And this was about an unholy alliance between the Liberal Party and the Tory Party. Liberal Party led by James Fox, at the time, Tory Party by Lord North. And he's the devil uniting them in this unholy union, And this thing about the fox and the badger seems to be, there's a theme about foxes fighting badgers. This is actually from a book that was published in 1851 to go with an exhibition of 40 animals stuffed in amusing poses like this. That was at the Great Exhibition in 1851, where the Crystal Palace was built for. And there's a fox and a badger here. And I'm sure Beatrix Potter must have seen these because, I heard of them at least. Because here's Beatrix Potter's Fox and the Badger having a fight in the badger's house. I mean, people think of Beatrix Potter as this sort of quite twee, these cute stories. They're actually very dark. A lot of them are very dark. This in the background, this is Peter Rabbit and his Benjamin Bunny, who followed a trail to here because the badgers kidnapped his babies, Benjamin Bunny's babies. He's taken them there to eat them. He's got to eat them. And when they arrive outside the set, there's sort of rabbit bones and skulls on the floor in the dust, outside. In the Tale of Squirrel Nutkin, the squirrels bring Old Owl a blood sacrifice of a mole. It's full of these. A first story, Peter Rabbit, 1904. Most of the stories, him trying to escape Mr. McGregor because he's killed his father already and he wants to put him in a pie. In the longest book, which is called The Fairy Caravan, she has a character in one chapter who eats magic mushrooms and goes on a trip for a chapter. I mean, it's really not what you think of a Beatrix Potter story. So anyway, in Grandville, I have actually a fight between a fox and a badger here in this steam room at one point. See, he's a bit of a bruiser, the rock. It's a scene from the second Grandville book. And this is a reference to, what's happened to this now? Stop working. Never mind. Mrs. Tiggerwintle here, the widow of the deceased. Oops. This is Randolph Caldecott, the illustrator who did this, who's a big influence on Beatrix Potter. She grew up reading Randolph Caldecott. This is from Froggy Would a Wooing Go, an illustration. And this rat in the chair here, if anyone knows Beatrix Potter's rat story, it was a tale of Samuel Whiskers. He looks remarkably like this rat. Another Caldecott story, this time a mad dog on a thing. I must admit this is quite a tenuous link because I wanted to link it to this. I do have a mad dog in the second Grandville story. He's a serial killer. Edward Mad Dog Mastock, rather. Mastic. Anybody heard of Lewis Wain? Lewis Wain, W-A-I-N. He's also known as the Cat Man. He did hundreds of illustrations of cats. He was bonkers about cats. He was crazy about cats. I thought you might have heard of him because only about 4 or 5 years ago, I think, there's a film came out with Benjamin Cumberbatch called The Electric Life of Lewis Wain. And you can see when he started off, they were quite naturalistic, his cats. But as they went on, they became cuter and more cartoony and stranger. And I think I've got a cartoon strip by him, yeah. He actually lived in America, in New York, for about 3 or 4 years. And while he was there, he did this comic strip about Tom Cat. Again, cats. He's crazy about cats. And he eventually went insane. He spent the last 10 years of his life in St. Mary's of Bethlehem Hospital in London, Bedlam, the actual Bedlam. And while he was there, he kept drawing these pictures of cats, portraits of cats. Look at these. This is during the 1930s. Don't they look like 1960s psychedelic posters? These are crackers. And there is a theory that it was actually cats that drove him mad, because cats can carry a parasite that can give you a disease called toxoplasmosis, which actually eats into your brain and can cause hallucinations and things. So it's never been proved, but that's the theory. But Lewis Wain's illustrations were extremely well known, very, very famous. Contemporary of Beatrix Potter. Beatrix Potter was born in 1866 and died in 43. And look, some of these artists, quite a few of these artists, are contemporaries of Potter. This is Benjamin Rabier, French illustrator. He did lots of these anthropomorphic pictures, but he's probably best known for this design he did to sell cheese. La Vache qui rit. It's here. You still see to this day on cheeses in France. You might think you recognise this. I don't think you can. But this was a motif. This dogs playing poker and dogs, playing pool and stuff. These are about 1910. There were a commission for T.M. Coolidge, this commercial artist, he did 12 of them to advertise cigars. You may notice the smoking cigars in some of the things, but I like this thing. Can you see it over here? This is dog passing the card. And these are the only two who are winning. If you look at how many tokens they've got, but he was a big influence, this T.M. Coolidge, on this artist Arthur Sarn, who produced a series inspired by his pictures in the 1950s. And during the 50s, these were the biggest posters, most popular posters sold in Britain and America. Sometimes you can still go in an old pub and see a yellowing poster of one of these in a frame. And they're usually the same cast of dogs in the stories. This one at the bottom, it's called Jack the Ripper. But I do have a cameo from the dogs in Grandville. This is the first Grandville. And they also make a reappearance in the fourth one. Another contemporary of Potter is Henri Klee, who's doing these wonderful line illustrations in Germany at the time. And this guy, what's this guy's name? I forgot. Another German artist, whose name I should remember, but it's just gone out of my head. But he was a socialist. He was very active against the Nazis, and he actually was arrested and spent a lot of time in prison during the war. But he lived till about 1980. I cannot remember his name. And we recognise this picture, famous illustration. It's Wind in the Willows, from the first edition of Wind in the Willows, and subsequent editions by Kenneth Graham. And this is Mole, and this is Ratty, rather, and Mole in Mole's living room. Illustration by E.H. Shepard. course, it became it was instant classic when it was published in 1908, but it was made a lot more famous when A. Milne, who also did an anthropomorphic book called House on Pooh Corner, which is where Winnie the Pooh comes from. He actually turned it into a stage play that was very popular in 1928, which was called Toad of Toad Hall. And so I'd ever seen the first Grandville with a rat and a mole in the mole's living room. And the rat in question is called Roderick Ratsey, and he's actually the Brock's adjunct. He's his sidekick. He's a bit of a mixture between Ratty and P.G. Woodhouse, his Bertie Wooster, and Nancy L. Sayers' Detective Lord Peter Wimsey. So he's like an upper class rat, not a rat, but he's sort of LeBrock's best friend. And he's actually named after this rat here, who's called Roderick. And this apparently is Tales of the Riverbank, its longest running TV series in the world. It started in the 1950s and it's still made sporadically. In fact, apparently there was a film in 2008, which I've not seen, which had Steve Coogan doing the voice of Ratty. So yeah, Tales of Rubber. This was on TV when I was a kid, of course. That's why I thought of him. Yeah, they used to have poor animals. They used to use real animals in these stories, and there had been toy cars going around and everything, boats and cars. There's even one where they put them in it. They climbed into a balloon. And it took off. You know, I mean, they actually filmed this balloon sailing away with these creatures in the basket. Of course, they used different animals. And they used to do things like between the keys of a piano, or in this case, a typewriter, they put cheese in between the keys, so it looked like they were playing the piano. They're not trying to pick this cheese out. It's a 1950s series of Snap, Woodhouse Snap. And you can see this is very by the mysteriously named Racy Helps. His name was Racy Helps. And apparently there's a website devoted to his work run by his grandson. But very Beatrix Potter sort of illustrations, influence illustrations. I love the fox up there, Mr. Cunningly Sly. It was good. Another series, this is a lot earlier. This is about 1910, I think. The Woodland Snap Happy Families. I don't know. I've actually got this card set. It's anonymous. There's nobody credited. There's a badger up there, a working class badger. And the reason I wanted to show you it was this hedgehog here. I've blown this up because he's reading a comic, and it's Comic Cut, which was the first British children's comic. Now you may not know this, but if you know the history of British comics, and I'm starting with the Bayeux Tapestry here, and through all the political broadsheets and the late Middle Ages and things like this, all the comics that were produced up to 1890, try and get your head around this, were for adult consumption. You know, it's now seen in Britain as a children's medium. They were all made for adult consumption through the political satire, through the so-called the comic supplements to newspapers, which is where the word comic comes from in the 19th century. They were all aimed at adults. They were all satirising politics or fashion or you name it. And this Victorian posh freelance journalist called Alfred Harmsworth, he was at a friend's house and he noticed that the kids were on the floor reading these comics. And they didn't get the jokes, didn't get the political jokes or whatever, but they loved following the animals in the pictures, not just the animals, but people. They just loved looking at them, and he thought, oh, I'll publish a comic for kids. And he published Comic Cuts. There it is. And it just took off. It was just huge. It's 1890. So big that within a year or two, it had literally hundreds of imitators put out by different publishers. He started publishing he published other children's comics, lots of them. And he made so much money off these comics. Within a few years, he launched 2 British newspapers, Daily Mirror and the Daily Mail. He went on to acquire the Times and the Telegraph and the Observer and became the biggest publishing magnate in the world. He was later made Lord Northcliffe. But these children's comics, they pushed out adult comics as there were Victorian adult comics. And the last one was called Alice Loper's Half Holiday, and that lasted till about 1921, I think, the final issue. And that was the end of adult comics in Britain for a while. But yeah, that's how children, they're regarded as a children's medium in Britain and in America as well. This is another one of his comics. This is a little bit later, 1914. But Rainbow was published from the 1890s. And this is Tiger Tim here. Anybody's heard of Tiger Tim? There he is. He appeared in not just the Rainbow, which is a colour comic. There's a lot of them were black and white. He was very popular. And in 1904, the editor of the Daily Mirror thought, well, let's tell you what, he asked Charles Stafford Baker, the illustrator, to do a Tiger Tim comic strip for the Daily Mirror. And it was Britain's first newspaper strip. And it became so popular, it was massive. There were people buying the Daily Mirror just so they could read Tiger Tim. Incredible. So when he launched the Daily Mail in 1914, he had a character developed for that, a comic character, to help sell the newspaper. And this is it, Tiger Tail. Teddy Tail, rather. And Teddy Tail was massive. He was a phenomenon. He went absolutely massive, and people were buying the Daily Mail just to write that slogan, Teddy Tail in the Daily Mail. Has anybody heard of Teddy Tail? These annuals, I think the last one came out in 1960, so they were going for quite a while, but he was massively famous. Everybody in the country would have heard of Tiger, for decades, would know who Teddy Tail was. Loads of merchandising clubs, things like this. There were even records on the BBC songs about Teddy Tail on the BBC, and nobody, how fleeting is fame, eh? Nobody's heard of him today. And I've not done this talk, a bit rusty on it. I've not done it since well before COVID. But even when I've had sort of, a couple hundred people in the audience, I've said, anybody here returned Tiger Tail? Nobody. Unless they're a comics historian or something, but yeah. So, in 1920, Lord Beaverbrook, who was a rival publisher to Harmsworth, he published Daily Express, first issue of the Daily Express, and he wanted to get some of this action because he could see that these comic strips for kids, basically, were selling the newspapers. So he asked this children's book illustrator, Mary Caldwell, to create a character for the Daily Express. She's better known as Mary Tortel these days. She married the editor, Herbert Tortel. But she created Rupert the Bear for him. She's still going today, still popular. And her stories are very simple nursery stories for very, very young kids. But Rupert, as a character, it only really took off in 1935 when the illustrator, Alfred E. Bestall, who done work for Punch magazine and all sorts of things, he was a well-established illustrator, he took over the writing and drawing of the strip. And he sort of introduced into Rupert this element of sort of heroic adventure and fantasy and science fiction. And so Rupert would go off and have these fantastic, usually the same in the morning. He was in Nutwood, his village where he lived, and he'd go off on an adventure and come back at the end of the day and tell his parents. Last panel was always him, a panel of him relating it to his parents. But he did these gorgeous clear line illustrations with a watercolour wash underneath, which was done in what's a style that's now called blue line style, a technique that's not used anymore because there's computers for it. I can explain if I'm interested what it is. But yeah, there's his dad. That's Dad. And I do have in Grandville, the first issue of Grandville. That's Rupert's house in the background. There's a murder in Nutwood. Starts how the first story starts off. And there's his dad mowing the lawn. And actually when LeBrock's leaving the town, you can see his dad cutting the hedge here in the background. And when he leaves Nutwood, you can actually see the sign in the background at the station. But at this point in the story, in the history of the story, Britain's been a French colony for 200 years by this point. At this point, as Roderick says to him, I say, those two coves over there, what was he saying? They sound jolly awkward, you know. And he said, no, have you not heard of it before? I said, oh, it's still spoken in some country places. It's English. So at this point in the story, you suddenly realise, oh my God, I've been reading French all the time. And to my mind, when I was a kid, I mean, these are my Christmas presents from my dad every year. That was I got from my dad, a Rupert the Bear annual. And his coolest mate for me was Bill the Badger. That's his one reason. I've got a badger protagonist. I think it's something to do with the stripes. They look a bit like a mask, black and white markings. And let's see, Bill the Badger is Billy Brock's School Days from a 1950s comic called, what was it called? Jack and Jill, I think it was from. No, it was Play Hour. But yeah, it's a bit like Tom Brown's School Days, only with a badger. Animal characters. So I have a character, the love interest in Grandville. LeBrock's girlfriend is a Parisian prostitute called Billy, with IE. Other side of the Atlantic, like a Crazy Cat. And you know Crazy Cat? Very well-known strip. It's written and drawn by George Harriman. But it was considered very avant-garde at the time. And you can see the sort of surreal language he uses, and the backgrounds change in between from panel to panel. Very surreal. And this was 6 years before the Surrealist Manifesto. It's before the beginning of the Surrealist movement in 1920. We actually, if anyone's interested in that, by the way, with my wife, we did a biography of the last surviving original surrealist who died in 2011, Leonora Carrington. If anyone wants to take one of these cards, yeah, you're welcome. Roy Wilson, he did a lot of these. I'll pass over these quickly because he did a lot of anthropomorphic stories in the 50s and 60s. British guy. This is quite interesting, put out during the. This came out right after the liberation of France, La Bête est morte. And it's basically came out in 2 volumes, 1944 and 1945. And basically it's history of the Second World War with animals. And this was actually done it was actually produced during the Nazi occupation under the noses. You know, as Edward Calvo, he did it while occupying. As soon as the Germans came out, it was published and very successful. But it's quite grim. It's not a children's story. There's bodies hanging from lampposts in the street and stuff like this in it. You can actually get this nice edition of it. This was published just a few years ago, republished, collected all together. Toby Twirl, another example of how these anthropomorphic books were very popular. Annuals. In America, there'd been Disney strips in newspapers, but I think it was only 1943 when the first Walt Disney's comics came out with different characters, Walt Disney characters in. But the best ones were drawn by a guy called Carl Barks, who did Walt Disney's comics and stories, and Uncle Scrooge, who's this one, who's very popular. And although these have sort of declined in America, the popularity of these Disney comics, they're still massive in Europe, still huge. I mean, sells great numbers. The Italian comic, weekly comic, Mickey Mouse, which is called Topolino, which means little mouse, is still strong. In Denmark, they used to sell, I don't know if they still do, but not many years ago, they used to sell 5 million copies. No, sorry, 1 million copies a week of the Donald Duck Weekly. This is a country with a population of about 5 million. You sell 1 million copies. Some sold over the border, but yeah, it's and in Denmark, Donald Duck's called Anders Ang, which means Anders Duck, definitely. But yeah, I do have a tribute to Uncle Scrooge in Grandville. You see him over here in the back. There's at the beginning of the second one, there's a bit of a massacre at an execution, where the condemned person makes this daring escape and shoots all the people who are lined up to watch him die with a submachine gun. And in this book, I have a sort of French version of Donald Duck there. Pogo, which is very popular, ran for years in America by Walt Kelly. This also had a surreal element to it, but it was very clever because it used to work on 2 levels. Kids used to love it, and it used to have slapstick humour in and jokes, stuff like that, but there'd be an adult sort of subtext to it that adults could enjoy, which is for a new newspaper. This came to the fore in the 1950s during the McCarthy witch hunt, in America, which there were people being sent to prison, exiled, all sorts of things, from a bit like today in Trump's America. But he introduced a character called Simple J. Malarkey, who was a caricature of Joe McCarthy, Senator Joe McCarthy, who was running these hearings. They're very brave of him. And a lot of the newspapers immediately refused to carry the strip, frightened of getting done for it. And some newspapers actually painted out the name, changed the name of the character. But yeah, it's quite brave of him at the time. 1954. Beano, which came out from 1938, had lots of, Beano and Dandy, all these British kids' comics. Always had anthropomorphic animals. Beano and the Dandy always had an anthropomorphic animal on the cover, especially. But, the 50s saw a revolution in British kids' comics when 3 young illustrators, they were only in 20s, they were 20 actually, most of them, Leo Baxendale, David Law, and guy did Jordan, Ken Reid. They started working for the Beano, and they suddenly changed the face of British comics, which were a bit staid up till that point. And Leo Baxendale invented the Bash Street Kids and Minnie the Minx, and David Law invented Dennis the Menace and Beryl the Peril. And suddenly the kids were like anarchists. They were anarchists, and so previous sort of figures of authority were the enemy. Park keepers, policemen, teachers. They suddenly became the enemy, and the Bash Street Kids would have mass battles with the police in the street, literally, have riots. But yeah, they were very good. And I do have I don't know if it's on this slideshow, but in Grandville 5, I do have a tribute to Leo Baxendale, who I knew for the last 20, 30 years of his life. So it was Jerry Donald Snooker from Jack and Jill by H.M. Talentier. And when I was a kid, this is from my comic when I was a kid, I've still got it, annual. This used to really creep me out, this strip. Anyway, this tradition in British comics has continued to the day. This is by Dave Windett, who's based in Preston, in Lancashire, who he's Corky the Cat, which is from the Dandy, Duckula, all these lots, Sonic the Hedgehog. Still does these things today. He's done The Simpsons and all sorts of things, but so lots of anthropomorphic stuff. Now, in the 60s, this sort of change happened where, the 60s, there was a renaissance in all different ways, and the counterculture was born. There's a hippie movement, and everything was love and peace. And out of the counterculture came underground comics. These are some American underground comics. There were some British ones. In fact, I came in on the tail. That's my first comics were British underground comics from the 70s, from the mid-70s. But these are some 60s American comics with animals in. Fritz the Cat by Robert Crumb, who's probably the most well-known American underground comics. There's Coochie Cootie by Robert Williams down there. And Wonder Warthog by Gilbert Shelton. My mate Gilbert Shelton lives in Paris now, Gilbert. He's better known for doing the strip The Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers. I don't know if you've heard of that. But these were very important publications. For the first time, these comics, the reclaimed comics as adult medium, because they were they were meant for adult. You know, they were experimental, they were outrageous, they were anti-establishment. The first feminist comics came out here. There was a pornographic comics. Definitely for adult consumption. They're all about sex, drugs and rock and roll, and they were anti the war in Vietnam. And but they reclaimed the medium, and it never went back. This was the start of why adults read comics today. This was, these led directly to the graphic novels of today, which started appearing in the late 70s. I did the first British one. And at that time, late 70s, early 80s, there were like 1 or 2 being produced a year, 2 or 3. And it's just grown exponentially. And now, I can't keep track of them. There's so many. There's hundreds of graphic novels published every year. It's become the most important way of telling a comic now, taking over from the pamphlet series of comics, style of comics. Rather. DC Comics even did a anthropomorphic series. This was the editor, Carmine Infanto. He tried to get the rights for the Planets of the Apes movies to do comic strip with. He couldn't get him, it all fell through. So he asked Jack Kirby, the fantastic creator of the Hulk, Fantastic Four, the Avengers, Captain America, etc. He'd left Marvel by that point. He was working for DC, and he said, can you create something like Planet of the Apes? And he got this commandy, last boy on Earth. He wakes up and the whole world's changed and evolved, and these animals have evolved, and he doesn't even know his name, and he walks out and looks, and it says above the bunker he's come out at Command D, and he thinks that's his name. And Jack Kirby wrote and drew these stories. But he didn't have to think very hard, because he'd already done it. He'd already done a version of this. In this strip he did in 1958 for, I think it's Shock Comics, something like that. And these actually predate the Planet of the Apes novels. An example of an anthropomorphic comic by Marvel is Howard the Duck, which was a satire comic. This comic was produced at the time of the American election. There's President Carter down there. Assassination attempt defended by a gunman. Thought he was in season, explains prisoner. This is by Gene Colan. And the art was by Gene Colan. And who wrote it? Coming out my head. Steve Gerber. Cerebus the Aardvark, which was self-published by Dave Sim, who wrote and drew it from 1977 onwards. It started as a very silly, the first issue or two was not very well drawn, silly Conan the Barbarian pastiche. But it very quickly developed. He ended up producing 300 issues of this. The final one was in 2004. And he quickly became the cutting edge of comics, what comics can do. And he made a lot of breakthroughs. And he's experimenting with Thinks balloons here, sound effects. He experimented with layouts, all sorts of things. He did brilliant work. He was later joined by Steve Gerhardt, who he employed to do backgrounds, like complicated buildings and stuff. But he drew it. Mouse ran took about 13 years to do altogether by Art Spiegelman. It originally ran in an adult comic called Raw. The first book was collected in 86, immediately becoming immensely popular, sold millions all over the world. Won first comic to win a Pulitzer Prize in America. The second volume of Mouse came out in 91. This was at the time of the first wave of the graphic novel boom in Britain and America, 86. Suddenly comics were cool again, and there weren't enough graphic novels at the time to keep up the momentum that there is now. Now most libraries have graphic novels, most shops have graphic novels. Then the only time you could buy a graphic novel was going into a comic shop, comic store, which were like boys' locker rooms, like seeing The Simpsons and things. 1984, Usagi Yojimbo was produced by Stan Sakai. It's still coming out once a month. Of course, the Yojimbo is the film by Kurosawa, famous samurai film, and Usagi means rabbit. These are still coming out. Same year, 84, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I can't remember which one's which, but I met them both actually. But one of them received a tax rebate, and the other one borrowed some money from his uncle, and they published the first edition. And the first thing, it was a silly pastiche, like Cerebus, again, of Daredevil, the comic Daredevil. I don't even know the origin of Daredevil in the Marvel comics, but he's crossing the street, he can see and everything, and he's hit on the crash, and this radioactive material hits him on the head, which makes him blind, but also gives him these super senses, Well, in Mutant Ninja Turtles, in the first one, we follow this vial of radioactive material as it rolls down and falls into the sewer, where it's absorbed by some turtles that kids have got sick of and thrown down the toilet, and they've ended up in the sewers, and they evolve. But like I said, they would have broke. They did this until they got this tax rebate, and then within 3 years, they're multimillionaires. The pair of them, they were, as you probably remember, they were from your childhood. These were massive. The movies made and everything. They sold millions. Well, they started. These little lads, they started a publishing venture in the 90s, called Tundra Publishing, and they spent millions publishing all sorts of rubbish. But they had the launch event, which I went to at the British Museum. I mean, can you imagine it? The room with the dinosaur in, the British Museum, the Natural History Museum. And there's all these canapes coming out every 5 minutes, and free drinks and everything. And I said to Kevin Eastman, I could not find somewhere more expensive, but they did waste a lot of money. They lost a lot of money on it. They hired this massive set of offices in the middle of London, and I think it was a tax loss, actually, because they made so much money to doing these things. Omaha the Cat Dancer, which was, not to put too fine a point in it, an erotic comic, pornographic comic by Reed Waller and Kate Worley. Reed, unfortunately, died. They got cancer. I actually contributed to the commemorative book with which all sorts of different artists did pictures of Omaha for it. I was really embarrassed because I forgot to put a tail on. So I actually have a tribute to Omaha. This actually by Reed Waller, this illustration. It's in the background of a Grandville panel. Well, I really recognise it. This is a pastiche. This is taken from that Musha, famous Alphonse Musha print at Nouveau print. Bone, which was first published in 84, and was published once a month till once every 2 months, I think, till 2004. It's now available in this series of albums, which are very nice. It's by Jeff Smith, and here's the eponymous hero, Bone, who's basically an anthropomorphic bone. And I mean, Jeff was very influenced by Lord of the Rings. He thought Lord of the Rings was really lovely. And also Pogo. We saw the strip before by Walt Kelly. It's in that sort of style. So it's really sort of fantasy, a long fantasy epic. It's all one story, you know, it's not little different stories. These contemporary comics. It's Hip Flask, it's like a science fiction detective story by Ladron here, and by Rich, what's his name? Not Rich Johnson. It'll come to me. Yeah, Black Sabbath by Canales and Gianido. This was first published, I think, in the 2000s in France. The two creators are Spanish, but it was first published in France. Sold hundreds of thousands. It's very popular now today. I think the 6 album came out recently, and it is brilliant. It is really good. It's basically a Raymond Chandler-esque type private detective in 1950s Los Angeles, and it's very good. Archie Canales is a big Grandville fan. I do have in the 5th one. I do have a tribute to Black Sabbath. Mouse Guard, David Peterson, basically Lord of the Rings with mice. I think this is that's the last example I think I'm showing. Oh, this is apparently I've not read this. I thought I'd put an example of a web comic up, so I can't comment on it. But the example of an anthropomorphic web comic. This illustration was published in 2014. By Ayana Farangadi, who's Iranian. And this is a caricature of the Iranian parliament debating this bill to restrict women's access to birth control. And she was sent to prison for it. She was condemned to 12 years, this young activist. And she'd only been there a couple of months, and she was condemned for something else while she was there. She was condemned for activity approaching intercourse, sexual intercourse, and indecent behaviour. Do you know what she did? She shook the hand of a solicitor who just visited her as he left. But anyway, she got out she was let out early a couple of years later. But apparently she's still quite outspoken. That's an example of how doing anthropomorphic comics can... it was said it insulted Islam, it insulted Iran. Yeah, this published this on a Facebook account. It was published in a paper, I think. And I think that's as far as I've got today. Oh, I think I've sent you an older version of this. I trimmed it down. I've sent you a wrong... Yeah, these are from some scenes from Grandville. What time is it? I could talk through them if you like, but...
1 minute past what?
All right. So I can talk about these. These are sort of references or inspirations in Grandville. This is the first Grandville starts off with these. I thought it was really clever writing. The assassins are wearing steam-powered, piston-driven wheelie boots. Try and draw one. Try inventing one. They're a murder to invent, but here they are. And it starts with this carriage, hansom cab, rattling across the cobbles. This was the first one that came out in 2007. And a month after it had come out, the first Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes film came out. And it starts with this hansom cab rattling over the carriage, rattling over cobbles in London. I thought they're going to think I pinched it from that. And it actually came out after mine. But yeah, it was inspired by this Victorian invention. This is a reference to a famous Victorian painting. I'll skip through these, which was also referenced by Tenniel for Alice. Look at the shape of the windows and everything. I don't just have animals in Grandville. There are also humans in the story, who the French call doorfaces, and the second-class citizens. And as the stories go on, you see them campaigning for rights and things like that. You know, it's a very subtle sort of, not all that subtle really, anti-racism thing. But of the characters, you usually see a famous French Franco-Belge comic characters. That the character up there, she was invented in 1904 by an artist called Pinon. Her comics don't come out anymore, but she just still does appear in these nursery albums. It's called Beccassine, the character. This character here is a reference to Spirou, yeah, staring me in the face. Yeah, by Robert Velmar in 1942, but done by quite a few different artists since his death. So these two, this is from the second Granville. These two characters are referenced to two famous. Yes, Spirou's big. He's next biggest thing to Tintin. You know, he's massive character in French comics. This is a reference to Gaston and Lucien, two French characters. This is Marsupilami, this character's called, who's he's also very big, especially a big famous children's character. They sell Marsupilami toys and dolls and all sorts of things. There is a reference to him in the second Grandville one. Here he is, somebody wearing a Marsupilami costume in a brothel. You probably recognise this reference. Because the Prime Minister of Britain in the story has to be a bulldog, hasn't he? You know, like Mr. Churchill. There's references to fine art in it. That this is, you see the characters in the background there. Or up to the Absinthe Drinker by Degas. It's always puzzled me why there's no legs on these tables. Have you noticed them floating in the air then? Everybody recognise this? Extremely famous reference. Rodin's The Kiss. Reference to Manet's Folie Bergère, although it's an eagle, not this. Actually, all the colours in this scene I have in the Folie Bergère are actually sampled from this painting. Yeah, the line work is done on a drawing board, pen and ink and brush, but I colour it on I colour Grandville on computer. Sarah Bernhardt, this is Sarah Blaireau in the story. Blaireau is French for badger. It's taken from an actual picture of Sarah Bernhardt's apartment, the Divine Sarah. Scene. Everybody know Gustave Doré, famous French illustrator, seen from a picture of an opium den. It's based loosely on that. And this character here, who's in the opium den, and he's drifting off, having dreams about going on adventures. He's called Snowy Milou, and it's a reference to Snowy. And his dreams are basically the Tintin adventures when you hear them. I can talk about Milou if you want. He has his French name. Snowy in France is called Milou. Reference to Ford Madox Brown. Is it Ford Madox Ford? Ford Madox Ford, yeah. Work. Famous pre-Raphaelite painting. It's by Caillebotte, sorry. Pronounce it T. French painter. Rue de Paris en temps de pluie. And this is Holman Hunt, famous Holman Hunt picture. It's in the Tate, this one. It's a reference to The Awakening Conscience by Holman Hunt. You probably recognise what this is to. This is from the fourth book, in which he has this messianic religious cult leader who's a unicorn, and everybody believes anything he says because a unicorn. He's got this hypnotic effect on people. And I was quite pleased with this because these are all the poses from the Last Supper. That everything they're saying echoes the body language in the picture. Right, so I've not even got the... I'd edited those out, sorry, this is the last one. I have a, in the new one talk, it finishes with a cover of the casebook of Stamford Hawksmoor, which is the new Grandville that's coming out in November over here, September in France, which is actually, Lebrock's not in it, it's about his mentor who's introduced in this book, Stamford Hawksmoor, who's an Eagle, who's based on Sherlock Holmes, basically. And that's a prequel. But I can talk about that. I can talk about anything you like. Anyway, that's the talk. If you got any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Oh, got some tea here. Thank you.